weak liberty, the ingenuous critique, and the myth of progress. Jean-Jacques Rousseau left us a story about the origins of social inequality that continues to be told and retold in endless variations to this day. It is the story of humanity's original innocence and unwitting departure of a state of pristine simplicity on a voyage of technological discovery that would ultimately guarantee both our complexity and our enslavement. How did this ambivalent story of civilization come about? Intellectual historians have never really abandoned the great man theory of history. They often write as if all important ideas in a given age can be traced back to one or other extraordinary individual, whether Plato, Confucius, Adam Smith, or Karl Marx, rather than seeing such others' writings as particularly brilliant interventions in debates that were already going on in taverns or dinner parties or public gardens, or, for that matter, lecture rooms, but which otherwise might never have been written down. It's a bit like pretending William Shakespeare had somehow invented the English language. In fact, many of Shakespeare's most brilliant turns of, of phrase turned out to have been common expressions of the day, which any Elizabethan Englishman or woman would be likely to have thrown into casual conversation, and whose author remain as obscure as those of knock-knock jokes. Even if, were it not for Shakespeare, they'd probably have passed out of use and been forgotten long ago. All this applies to Rousseau. Intellectual historians sometimes write as if Rousseau had personally kicked off the debate about social inequality with his 1754 discourse on the origin and the foundation of inequality among mankind. In fact, he wrote it to submit an essay content on the subject, in which we saw how critics of Eurocentrism can backfire and end up turning Aboriginal thinkers into sock puppets. In March 1754, the learned society known as the Académie des Sciences, Arts, and Arts et Belles Lettres de Dijon announced a national essay competition on the question, what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? What we'd like to do in this chapter is ask, why is it that a group of scholars in ancient regime France hosting a national essay contest would have felt this was an appropriate question in the first place? The way of question is put, after all, assumes that social inequality did have an origin. That is, it takes for granted that there was a time when human beings were equals, and that something then happened to change this situation. That is actually quite a startling thing for people living under an absolutist monarchy like that of Louis XV to think. After all, it's not as if anyone in France at that time had much personal experience of living in a society of equals. This was a culture in which in most absolute every aspect of human interaction, whether eating, drinking, working, or socializing, was marked by elaborate pecking orders and rituals of social deference. The authors who submitted their essays to this competition were men who spent their lives having all their needs attended to by servants. They lived off the patronage of dukes and archbishops and rarely entered a building without knowing the precise order of importance of everyone inside. Rousseau was one such man, an ambitious young philosopher. He was at the time engaged in an elaborate object of trying to slip his way into influence at court. The closest he'd likely ever come to experiencing social equality himself was someone doling out equal slices of cake at a dinner party. Yet everyone at the time also agreed that the situation was somehow unnatural, that it had not always been that way. If we want to understand what that was, we need to look we need to look not only at France but also at France's place in a much larger world. Fascination with the question of social inequality was relatively new in 1700s, and it had everything to do with the shock and confusion that followed Europe's sudden integration into a global economy where it had long been a very minor player. In the Middle Ages, most people in other parts of the world who actually knew anything about Northern Europe at all considered it an, an obscure and unfighting backwater full of religious fanatics who, aside from occasional attacks on their neighbors, the Crusaders, were largely irrelevant to global trade and world politics. European intellectuals of that time were just rediscovering Aristotle and the ancient world and had very little idea what people were thinking and arguing about anywhere else. All this changed, of course, in the late 15th century when Portuguese fleets began rounding Africa and bursting into the Indian Ocean, and especially with the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Suddenly, a few of the more powerful European kingdoms found, found themselves in control of vast stretches of the globe, and European intellectuals found themselves exposed not only to the civilizations of China and India, but to a whole plethora of previously unimagined social, scientific, and political ideas. The ultimate result of this flood of new ideas came to be known as the Enlightenment. Of course, this isn't usually the way historians of ideas tell the story. Not only are we not only are we taught to think of intellectual history as something largely produced by individuals writing great books or thinking great thoughts, but these great thinkers are assumed to perform both these thing, both these activities almost exclusively with reference to each other. As a result, even in cases where Enlightenment thinkers openly insisted they were getting their ideas from foreign sources, as the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz did, did when he urged his compatriots to adopt China's models of statecraft. There's a tendency for contemporary historians to insist they weren't really serious, or else that when they said they were embracing Chinese or Persian or indigenous American ideas that weren't really Chinese, Persian, or indigenous American ideas at all, but ones they themselves had made up and merely attributed to exotic others. These are remarkably arrogant assumptions, as if Western thought, as it later came to be known, was such a powerful and monolithic body of ideas that no one else could possibly have any meaningful influence on it. It's also pretty obviously untrue. Just consider the case of Leibniz. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, European governments gradually came to adopt the idea that every government should properly preside over a population of largely uniform language and culture, run by a bureaucratic official dome trained in the liberal arts, whose members had succeeded in passing competitive exams. It might seem surprising that they did so, something remotely like that had existed in any previous period of European history. Yet it was almost exactly the system that had existed for centuries in China. Are we really to insist that the advocacy of China's models of statecraft of by Leibniz, his allies and followers really had nothing to do with the fact that Europeans did, in fact, adopt something that looks very much like China's models of statecraft? What's really unusual about this case is that Leibniz was so honest about his intellectual influences. When he lived, church authorities still wielded a great deal of power in most of Europe. Anyone making an argument that non-Christian ways were in any way superior might find themselves facing charge of atheism, which was potentially a capital offense. It is much the same with the question of inequality. If we ask not what are the if we ask not what are the origins of social inequality, but what are the origins of the question about the origins of social inequality? In other words, how did it come about that in 1754 the Académie de Dijon would think this would think this an appropriate question to ask? Then we are immediately confronted with a long history of Europeans agreeing with one another about the nature of Arawai societies in this case, particularly in the eastern woodlands of North America. What's more, a lot of those conversations make reference to arguments that took place between Europeans and indigenous Americans about the nature of freedom, equality, or for that matter rationality and reflect religion. Indeed, most of the most of the themes that would later become central to Enlightenment political thought. Many influential Enlightenment thinkers did in fact claim that some of their ideas on the subject were directly taken by Native American sources, even though, predictably, intellectual historians today insist this cannot really be the case. Indigenous people are assumed to have lived in a completely different universe, inhabited a different reality. Even anything Europeans said about them was simply a shadow play projection fantasies of the noble savage cult for the European tradition itself. Of course, such historians typically frame this portion as a critique of Western arrogance. How can you suggest that genocidational imperialists were actually listening to those whose societies they were in the process of stamping out? But it could equally be but it could equally well be seen as a form of Western arrogance in its own right. There is no contesting that European traders, missionaries, and settlers did actually engage in prolonged conversations with people they encountered in what they called the New World, and often lived among them for extended periods of time, even as they also colluded in their destruction. We also know that many of those living in Europe who came to embrace principles of freedom and equality, principles barely existing in their countries a few generations before, claimed that uh, claimed the accounts of these encounters had a profound influence on their thinking. To deny any possibility they were like they that they were right is effectively to insist that indigenous people could not possibly have any real impact on history. It is in fact a way of infantilizing non-Westerners, a practice denounced by these very same authors. In recent years, a growing number of American scholars, most themselves of indigenous descent, have challenged these assumptions. Here, we follow in their footsteps. Basically, we are going to retell the story starting from the assumption that all parties to the conversation between European colonies and their indigenous interlocutors were adults, and that, at least occasionally, they actually listen to each other. If we do this, even familiar histories suddenly begin to look very different. In fact, what we'll see is not only that indigenous Americans confronted with strange foreigners gradually developed their own surprisingly consistent critiques of European institutions, but that these critiques came, came to be taken very seriously in Europe itself. Just how seriously can hardly be overstated. For European audiences, the indigenous critic will come as a shock to the system, revealing possibilities for human emancipation that, once disclosed, could hardly be ignored. Indeed, the ideas expressed in the critic came to be perceived as such a menace to the fabric of European society that an entire body of theory was called into being specifically to refute them. As we will shortly see, the whole story we summarize in the last chapter, our standard historical meta-narrative about the ambivalent progress of human civilization, where where freedoms are lost as societies grow bigger and more complex, was invented largely for the purpose of neutralizing the threat of indigenous critique. The first thing to emphasize is that the origin of social inequality is not a problem which would have made sense to anyone in the Middle Ages. Ranks and hierarchies were assumed to have existed from the beginning. Even in the Garden of Eden, as the 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas observed, Adam clearly outranked Eve. Social equality and therefore its opposite, inequality, simply did not exist as a concept. A recent survey of medieval literature by two Italian scholars in fact finds no evidence that the Latin terms equalitas or inequalitas or the English, French, Spanish, German, and Italian cognates were used to describe social relations at all before the time of Columbus. So one cannot even say that medieval thinkers rejected the notion of social equality. The idea that it might exist seems never to have occurred to them. In fact, the term equality and inequality only began to enter common currency in the early 17th century under the influence of natural law theory. And natural law theory in turn arose largely in the course of debates about the moral and legal implications of Europe's discoveries in the New World. It's important to remember that Spanish adventurers like Cortes and Pizarro carried about their conquest largely without authorization from high authorities. Afterwards, there were intense debates back home and over whether such unfairness aggression against people who, after all, posed no threat to Europeans could really be justified. The key problem was that, unlike non-Christians of the Old World, who could be assumed to have had the opportunity the, the, to learn the teaching of Jesus, and therefore to have actively rejected them, it was fairly obvious that The inhabitants of the New World simply never had any exposure to Christian ideas, so they could not be classed as infidels. The conquistadors generally finished this question by reading a declaration in Latin, calling on all the Indians to convert before attacking them. Legal scholars in universities like Salamanca in Spain were not impressed by this expedient. At the same time, attempts to write off the inhabitants of the Americas as so utterly alien that they fell outside the bounds of humanity entirely and could be treated literally like animals, also did not find much purchase. Even cannibals, the jurists noted, had governments, societies, and laws, and were able to construct arguments to defend the justice of their cannibalistic social arrangements. Therefore, they were clearly humans, vested by God with powers of reason. The legal and philosophical question then become, what rights do human beings have simply by dint of being human? That is, what rights could they be said to have naturally, even if they existed in the state of nature, innocent of the teachings of written philosophy and revealed religion, and without codified laws? The matter was hotly debated. We need not linger here on the exact formulae that natural law theorists came up with. Suffice to say, they did allow that Americans had natural rights, but ended up justifying the conquest anyway, provided the subsequent treatment was not too violent or oppressive. What but what is important in this context is that they open a conceptual door. Writers like Thomas Hobbes, Hugo Grotius, or Thomas Locke could skip past the biblical narratives even everyone used to start with and begin instead with a question such as what might humans have been like in a set of nature when all they had was their humanity. Each of these authors populated the state of nature with what they looked to be the simplest societies known in the Western Hemisphere, and thus they concluded that the original state of humanity was one of freedom and equality, for better or worse. Hobbes, for example, definitely felt it was worse. It's important to stop here for a moment and consider why then came to this verdict, because it was by no means an obvious or inevitable conclusion. First of all, while it may seem obvious to us, the fact that natural law theories in the 17th century fixed on apparently simple societies as exemplars of primordial times, societies like the Algo- Algonquians of North America's eastern woodland, or the Caribs and Amazonians, rather than urban civilizations like the Aztecs or Inca, would not would not have seemed obvious at the time. Earlier authors, confronted by a population of forest dwellers with no king and employing only stone tools, were unlikely to have seen them as in any way primordial. 16th century scholars, such as the Spanish missionary Jose de Acosta, were more likely to conclude they were looking at the fallen vestiges of some ancient civilization or refugees who had, in the course of their wanderings, forgotten the acts of metallurgy and civil governance. Such an conclusion would have made obvious common sense for people who assumed that all three important knowledge had been revealed by God at the beginning of time, that cities had existed before the flood, and that saw their own intellectual life largely as attempts to recover the lost wisdom of ancient Greeks and Romans. History in Renaissance Europe of the 15th to 16th centuries was not a story of progress. It was largely a series of disasters. Introducing the concept of a state of nature did not exactly flip all this around, at least not immediately, but it did allow political philosophers after after the 17th century to imagine people without trappings of civilization as something other than generate savage, as a kind of humanity in the raw, and this in turn allowed them to ask a host of new questions about what it meant to be human. What social forms would what social forms would still exist even among people who had no recognizable form of law or government? Would marriage exist? What forms might it take? Would natural men tend to be naturally gregarious? Or would people tend to avoid one another? Was there such a thing as natural religion? But the question still remains, why is it that by the 18th century, European intellectuals had come to fix on the idea of primordial freedom, or especially equality, to such an extent that it seemed perfectly natural to ask a question like, what is the origin of inequality among men? This seems particularly odd considering how, prior to that time, most did most did not even consider social equality possible. First of all, a qualification is in order. A certain folk egalitarianism already existed in the Middle Ages, coming to the fore during popular festivals like Carnival, May Day, or Christmas, when much of society reveled in the idea of a world turned upside down, when all powers and authorities were knocked to the ground or made of mockery of. Often the celebrations were framed as a return to some primordial age of equality, the age of Cronus or Saturn, or the land of Cocaigne. Sometimes, too, these ideals were invoked in popular revolts. True, it's never entirely clear how far such egalitarian ideals are merely a side effect of hierarchical social arrangements that obtain at ordinary times. Our notion that everyone is equal before the law, for instance, originally traces back to the idea that everyone is equal before the king or emperor, since if one man is invested with absolute power, then obviously everyone else is equal in comparison. Early Christianity similarly insisted that all believers were, in some ultimate sense, equal in relation to God, whom they refer to as the Lord. As this, illustra- as this illustrates, the overarching people, the overarching power under which ordinary mortals are all de facto equals need not be the, need not be a real flesh and blood human. One of the whole points of creating a carnival king or queen is that they exist in order to be dethroned. Europeans educated in classical literature would also have been familiar with speculation about long ago happy egalitarian orders that appear in Greco-Roman sources, and notions of equality, at least among Christian nations, were to be found in the concept of res publica or commonwealth, which again look to ancient precedents. All this is only to say that a state of equality was not utterly inconceivable to European intellectuals before the 18th century. None of it, however, explains why they came almost universally to assume that human beings, innocent of civilization, will ever exist in such a state. True, there were classical precedents in such ideas, but there were classical precedents for the opposite as well. For answers, we must return to arguments deployed to establish that the inhabitants of the Americas were fellow humans to begin with, to assert that, however exotic or even perverse their custom might seem, Native Americans were capable of making logical arguments in their own defense. What we're going to suggest is that American intellectuals, we are using the term American as it was used at the time to refer the indigenous inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere, and intellectual to refer to anyone in the habit of arguing about abstract ideas, actually played a role in this conceptual revolution. It is very strange that this should be considered as a particular radical idea, but among mainstream intellectual historians today, it's almost a heresy. What makes this especially odd is that no one denies that many European explorers, missionaries, traders, settlers, and others who sojourned on American shores spent years learning native language and perfecting their skills in conversation with native speakers, just as indigenous Americans did the work of learning Spanish, English, Dutch, or French. Neither we think would anyone who has ever learned a three alien language deny that doing so takes a great deal of imaginative work, trying to grasp unfamiliar concepts. We also know that missionaries typically conducted long philosophical debates as part of their fellow professional duties. Many others, on both sides, argued with one another, either out of simplest curiosity or because they had immediate practical reasons to understand the other's point of view. Finally, no one would deny that travel literature and missionary relations, which often contain summaries of or even extracts from these exchanges, were popular literary genres avidly followed by educated Europeans. Any middle-class household in 18th century Amsterdam or Grenoble would have been likely to have on its shelves at the very least a copy of the Jesuit Relations of New France, as French North American colonies were then known, and one or two accounts written by voyagers to faraway lands. Such book Such books were appreciated largely because they contain surprising and unprecedented ideas. Historians are aware of all this, yet the overwhelming majority still conclude that even when European authors explicitly say that they are borrowing ideas, concepts, and arguments from indigenous thinkers, one should not take them seriously. It's all just supposed to be some kind of misunderstanding, fabrication, or at best a naive projection of pre-existing European ideas. American intellectuals, when they appear in European accounts, are assumed to be more representatives of some Western archetype of the noble savage or sock puppets, used as plausible alibis to an order who might otherwise get into trouble for presenting subversive ideas, deism, for example, or rational materialism, or unconventional views on marriage. Certainly, if one encounters an argument ascribed to a savage in a European text that even remotely resembles anything to be found in Cicero or Erasmus, one is automatically supposed to assume that no savage could possibly have really said it, or even that the conversation in question never really took place at all. If nothing else, this habit of thought is very convenient for students of Western literature, themselves retrained and Cicero and Rasmus, who might otherwise be forced to actually try to learn something about what indigenous people thought about the world and above all what they made of Europeans. We intend to proceed in the opposite direction. We will examine early missionary and travel account for New France, especially the Great Lake region, since there were the account of Rousseau himself was most familiar with to get a sense of what its indigenous inhabitants did actually think of French society and how they came to think of their own societies differently as a result. We will argue that indigenous Americans did indeed develop a very strong critical view of their infant's institutions, a view which focused first on these institutions' lack of freedom, and only later, as they become more familiar with European social arrangements on equality. One of the reasons that missionary and travel literature became so popular in European was precisely because it exposed its readers to this kind of criticism, along with providing a sense of social possibility. The knowledge that familiar ways were not the only ways, since, as this book showed, as this book showed, there were clearly societies in existence that did things very differently. We will suggest that there is a reason why so many key enlightenment thinkers insisted that their ideals of individual liberty and political equality were inspired by Native American sources and examples, because it was true, in which we consider what the inhabitants of New France made of the European invaders, especially in matters of their generosity, sociability, material wealth, crime, punishment, and liberty. The age of reason was an age of debate. The Enlightenment was rooted in conversation. It took place largely in cafes and salons. Many class Enlightenment texts took the form of dialogues, most cultivated and easy, transparent, conversational style, clearly inspired by the salon. It was the Germans, back then, who tended to write in the obscure style for which French intellectuals have since become famous. Appeal to reason was above all a style of argument. The idea of the ideal of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, took the form the, took the form they did in the course of such a long series of debates and conversations. All we're going to suggest here is that those conversations stretch back further than Enlightenment historians assume. Let's begin by asking, what did the inhabitants of New France m- make of the Europeans who began to arrive on the shores in the 16th century? At the time, the region that came to be to At the time, the region that came to be known as New France was inhabited largely by speakers of mountainous Naskapi, Algonquians, and Iroquoians language. Those closer to the coast were fishers, foresters, and hunters. To most also practiced horticulture. The Wendan Huron concentrated in major river valleys further inland, growing maize, squash, and beans around fortified towns. Interestingly, early French observers attached little importance to such economic distinctions, especially since foraging or farming was, in either case, largely women's work. The men, they noted, were primarily occupied in hunting and occasionally war, which meant they could, in a sense, be considered natural aristocrats. The idea of the noble savage can be traced back to such estimations. Originally, it didn't refer to nobility of character, but simply to the fact that the Indian men concerned themselves with hunting and fighting, which back at home were largely were largely the business of noblemen. But if French assess, but if French assessments of the character of Savage tended to be decidedly mixed, the ingenious assessment of French character was distinctly less so. Father Pierre Biard, for example, was a former theology professor assigned in 1608 to evangelist the Algonquian-speaking Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, who had lived for some time next to a French fort. Biard did not think much of the Mi'kmaq, but reported that the feeling was mutual. They considered themselves better than the French, for, they say, you are always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peaceably. You are infused and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind as for us. If we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor. They are saying this and like things continually. What seemed to irritate Bjart the most was that the Mi'kmaq would constantly assert that they were, as a result, richer than the French. The French had more material possessions than Mi'kmaq conceded, but they had other, greater assets, ease, comfort, and time. 20 years later, Brother Gabriel Sagard, a Recollet Friar, who wrote, who, wrote similar things of the Wendat nation. Sagard was at first highly critical of Wendat life, which he described as inherently sinful. He was obsessed with the idea that Wendat women were all intent on seducing him. But by the end of his sojourn, he had come to the conclusion that social arrangements were in many ways superior to those at home in France. In the following passages, he was clearly echoing Wendat's home opinion. They have no they have no lawsuits and take little pains to the, to acquire the goods of this life, for which Christians torment is ourselves so much, and for our excessive and insatiable greed in acquiring them, we are justly and with reason reproved by their quiet life and tranquil dispositions. Much like Biard's Mi'kmaq, the Wendat, the Wendat were particularly offended by the French lack of generosity to one another. They, repros- they reciprocate hospitality and give such assistance to one another that the necessities of all are provided with, for without there being any indigent beggar in their towns and villages. And they considered it a very bad thing when they heard it said that there were there were in France a great many of these needy beggars, and thought that this was for lack of charity in us, and blame us for it severely. When that case a similarly jaundiced eye at French habits of conversation, Sagat was surprised and impressed by his host's eloquence and powers of recent argument, skilled on skilled on skills honed by nearly public discussions of communal affairs. His host, in contrast, When they did get when they did get to see a group of Frenchmen gathered together, often remarked on the way they seemed to be constantly scrambling over each other and cutting each other off in conversation, employing weak arguments and overall. Also, the subtext seemed to be not showing themselves to be particularly bright. People who tried to grab the stage, denying others the means to present their arguments, were acting in much the same way as those who grabbed the material means of subsistence and refused to share it. It is hard to avoid the impression that Americans saw the French as existing in a kind of st- Hobbesian state of war of against all. It's probably worthy of remark that especially in this early contact period, Americans were likely to have known Europeans largely through missionaries, trappers, merchants, and soldiers. That is, groups almost entirely composed of men. There were at first very few French women in their colonies and few children. This probably had the effect of making the competitiveness and lack of mutual care among them seem all the more extreme. Sagat's account of his stay among the Wendat became an influential bestseller in France and across Europe. Both Locke and Voltaire cite Le Grand Voyage du Pays de Huron as a principal source for their descriptions of American societies. The multi-authored and much more extensive Jesuit relations, which appeared between 1633 and 1673, were also widely read and debated in Europe, and include many a similar remonstrance aimed at the French by Wendat observer. One of the one of the most striking things about these 71 volumes of missionary field reports is that neither the Americans nor the French interlocutors appear to have had very much to say about equality per se. For example, the word "égal" or "égalité" barely barely appear, and on those very few occasions where they do, it's almost always in reference to equality of the sexes, something the Jesuits found particularly scandalous. This appears to be the case, irrespective of whether the Jesuits in question were agreeing with the Wendat, who might not seem egalitarian in anthropological terms, since they had former political offices and a stratum of war captives, whom the Jesuits, at least, referred to as slaves of the Mi'kmaq or the mountainous Naskapi, who were organized into what led anthropologists would consider egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers. Instead, we hear a multiplicity of American voices complaining about the competitiveness and selfishness of the French, and even more, perhaps, about their hostility to freedom. That indigenous Americans lived in a generally free societies, and that Europeans did not, was never really a matter of debate in these exchanges. Both sides agreed this was the case. What they differed on was whether or not individual liberty was desirable. This is one area in which early missionary or travelers' accounts of the Americas pose a, genu- a genuine conceptual challenge to most readers today. Most of us simply take it for granted that Western observers, even 17th century, even 17th century ones, are simply an earlier version of ourselves, unlike ingenious Americans who represent an essentially alien, perhaps even unknowable order. But in fact, in many ways, the authors of this text were nothing like us. When it came to questions of personal freedom, the equality of men and women, sexual mores and or popular sovereignty, or even, for that matter, theories of depth psychology, indigenous American, atti- indigenous American attitudes are likely to be far closer to the readers on the 17th century European ones. These differing views on individual liberty as especially striking. Nowadays, it's almost impossible for anyone living in a liberal democracy to say they are against freedom, at least in abstract. In but this, of course, all ideas are usually much more nuanced. This is one of the lasting legacies of the Enlightenment and of the American and French revolutions. Personal freedom, we tend to believe, is inherently good, even if some of us also feel that a society based on total individual liberty, one which took it, one which took it so far as to eliminate police prisons or any sort of apparatus coercion, who instantly collapsed into violent chaos. 17th century Jesuits most certainly did not share this assumption. They tended to view individual liberty as animalistic. In 1640, in 1642, the Jesuit missionary Lejeune wrote the Montaigne's Nascapi. They imagined that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of what as cults, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever except when they are like. They have repulsed me 100 times because we failed our captains, while they laugh at while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful in so far as he is eloquent, and even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. In the considered opinion of the Montaigne Nascapi, however, the French were little better than slaves, living in constant terror of their superiors. Such criticism appears regularly in Jesuit accounts. What's more, it comes not just for those who live in nomadic bands, but equally from townsfolk like the Wendat. The missionaries, moreover, were willing to concede that this was this was not all just rhetoric on the Americans' part, even when the statements couldn't compel anyone to do anything they didn't wish to do. As Father Lalman, whose correspondence provided an initial model for the Jesuit relations, noted of the Wendat in 1644. I don't believe that there is any people on earth freer than they, and less able to allow the subjection of their wills to any power whatever, so much so that fathers here have no control over their over their children, or captains over their subjects, or the laws of the country over any of them, except in so far as each is pleased to submit to them. There is no punishment which is inflicted on the guilty, and no criminal who is not sure that his life and property are in no danger. Lalman's account gives a sense of just how politically challenging some of the material to be found in the Jesuit relations must have been to European audience of the time, and why so many found it fascinating. After expanding on how scandalous it was that even murderers should get off scot free, the good father did admit that when considered as a means of keeping the peace, the Wendat system of justice was not, was not ineffective. Actually, it worked surprisingly well. Rather than punish culprits, the Wendat insisted the culprits' entire lineage of clan pay compensation. This made this made it everyone's responsibility to keep their kindred under control. It is not the guilty who suffer the penalty, Lalman explains, but rather the public that must make amends for the offences of the individuals. If a Huron had killed an Algonquin or another Huron, the whole country assembled to agree the number of gifts due to giving relatives to stay the vengeance that they might take. When the captains, as Lalman then goes as Lalman then goes on to describe, urge their subjects to provide what is needed. No one is compelled to it, but those who are willing bring publicly what they wish to contribute. It seems as if they feed with one another according to the amount of their wealth, and as the desire of glory and of appearing solicitous for the public welfare use them to do on like occasions. More remarkable still, he concedes this form of justice restrains all these peoples and seems more effectually to repress disorders than the personal punishment of criminals does in France. Despite despite being a very mild proceeding which leaves individuals in such a spirit of liberty that they never submit to any laws and obey no other impulse than that of their own will. There are a number of things worth noting here. One is that it makes clear that some people were indeed considered wealthy, when that society was not economically egalitarian in that sense. However, there was a difference between what we consider economic resources like land, which was owned by families, worked by men, and whose products were largely disposed of by women's collectives, and the kind of wealth being referred to here, such as wampun, a word applied to strings and belts of beads manufactured from the cells of Long Island's cargo clam, or other treasures which largely existed for political purposes. Wealthy when that men hoarded such precious things largely to be able to give them away on dramatic occasions like this. Neither in the case of land and agricultural products nor that of wampum and similar valuables was there anywhere a transformed access to material resources into power, at least not the kind of power that might allow one to make work for you or compel them to do anything they did not wish to do. At best, the accumulation and adroit distribution of riches might make a man more likely to aspire to political office, to become a chief or captain. The French sources tend to use these terms in an indiscriminate fashion, but as the Jesuits all continually emphasize, merely holding political office did not give anyone the right to give anybody orders either. Or, to be completely accurate, an office holder could give all the orders he or she liked, but no one has under any particular obligation to follow them. To the Jesuits, of course, all this was outrageous. In fact, their attitude towards indigenous ideals of liberty is the exact opposite of the attitude most French people or Canadians tend to hold today. That in principle, freedom is an altogether admirable ideal. Father Lalman, though, was willing to admit that in practice such a system worked quite well. It created much less it created much less disorder than there is in France. But as he noted, the Jesuits were opposed to freedom in principle. This, without doubt, is a disposition quite contrary to the spirit of the faith, which requires us to submit not only our wills, but our minds, our judgment, our judgments, and all the sentiments of men to a power unknown to our senses, to a law that is not earth, and that is entirely opposed to the laws and sentiments of corrupt nature. Add to this that the law of the country, which to them seem most just, attack the purity of the Christian life in thousand ways, especially as regards their marriage. The Jesuit relations are full of this of thing. Scandalous scandalous missionaries frequently reported that American women were considered to have full control over their own bodies, and that therefore unmarried women had sexual liberty and married women could divorce at will. This, for the Jesuits, was an outrage. Such sinful conduct, they believed, was just the extension of a more general principle of freedom, rooted in natural dispositions which they saw as inherently pernicious. The weak liberty of the fas- the weak liberty of the savage, one insisted, was the single greatest impediment to their submitting to the yoke of the law of God. Even finding terms to translate concepts like Lord, commandment, or obedience into ingenious language was extremely difficult. Explaining the underlying theological concepts well nigh impossible, in which we saw how Europeans learned from Native Americans about the connection between reason debate, personal freedoms, and the refusal of arbitrary power. In political terms, then, French and Americans were not arguing about equality but about freedom, about the only specific reference to political equality that appears in the 71 volumes of the Jesuit Relations occurs almost as an aside in the account of an event in 1648. It happened in the settlement of Christians when that were near the town of Quebec. After a disturbance caused by a shipload of illegal liquor finding its way into the community, the governor persuaded Wendat leaders to agree to a prohibition of alcoholic beverages and published an edict to that effect. Cruci- cruci- Crucially, the governor notes, backed up by the threat of punishment. Father Gladman again records the story. For him, this was a focal event. From the beginning of the world to the coming of the French, the savages has never known what it was so solemnly to forbid or get anything to the people, underlying any penalty, however slight. There are free people, each of whom considers himself of as much conquest, of as much consequence as the others, and they submit to the chiefs only insofar as it pleases them. Equality here is a direct distinction of freedom. Indeed, is its expression. It also has almost nothing in common with the more familiar Eurasian notion of equality before the law, which is ultimately equality before the sovereign, that is, once again, equality is common subjugation. Americans, by contrast, were equal insofar as they were equally free to obey or disobey orders as they saw fit. The democratic governance of the Wendat and five nations of the Haudenosaunee, which so impressed later European readers, was an expression of the same principle. If no compulsion was allowed, then obviously such social coherence as did exist had to be created through, through reasoned debate, persuasive arguments, and and the establishment of social consensus. Here we return to the matter with which we began, the European Enlightenment as as the apotheosis of the principle of open and rational debate. We've already mentioned Sagat's grudging respect for the Wendat facility in logical argumentation, a theme, a theme that also runs to most Jesuit accounts. At this point, it's important to bear in mind that the Jesuits were the intellectuals of the Catholic world. Trained in classical rhetoric and techniques of disputation, Jesuits had learned the American language. pri- langu- la- had, Jesuits had learned the American languages primarily so as to be able to argue with them, to persuade them of the superiority of the Christian faith. Yet they regularly found themselves startled and impressed by the quality of the counter-arguments they had to contend with. How could such rhetorical facility have come to those with no awareness of the works of Varro and Quintilian? In considering the matter, the Jesuits almost always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So, Father Lejeune, superior of the Jesuits in Canada in 1630s, there are almost none of them incapable of conversing or reasoning very well and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. The councils, held almost every day in the villages and on almost all matters, improved their capacity for talking. Or, in Dalman's words, I can say in truth that, as rare as intelligence, they are in no wise inferior to Europeans and to those which dwell in France. I would never have believed that, without instruction, Nature could have supplied a most ready, re, uh, Nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence, which I have admired in many Hurons, or more clear-sightedness in public affairs, or a more discreet management in things to which they are accustomed. Some Jesuits were further, remarking, not without a trace of frustration, that New World savages seem greater cleverer overall than the people they were used to dealing with at home, e.g. They nearly all saw more intelligence in their business, speeches, courtesies, intercourse, tricks, subtleties, than do the shrewdness than do the shrewdest citizens and merchants in France. Jesuits then clearly recognized and acknowledged an intrinsic relation between refusal of arbitrary power, open and inclusive political debate, and a test of a reasoned argument. It's true that Native American political leaders, who in most cases had no means to compel anyone to do anything they had not agreed to do, were famous for their rhetorical powers. Even hardened Europeans and generals pursuing genocidal campaigns against ingenious people, ingenious peoples often reported themselves reduced to tears by their powers of eloquence. Still, persuasiveness need not take did not take the form of logical argumentation. It can just as easily involve appeal to sentiment, whipping up persuasions, deploying poetic metaphors, appealing to bits of proverbial wisdom, employing irony and indirection. Humor, in short, or appeals to prophecy or revelation, and the degree to which one privileges any of these has everything to do with the rhetorical tradition to which the speaker belongs and the presumed dispositions of their audience. It was largely to speakers of Iroquoian languages such as the Wendat of the five Haudenosaunee nations to the south who appear to have placed such weight on recent debate, even finding it a form of pleasurable entertainment in own right. This fact alone had major historical repercussions. Before it appears to have been exactly this form of debate, rational, skeptical, empirical, conversational in tone, which before which before long came to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well. And just like the Jesuits, Enlightenment thinkers and democratic revolutionaries saw it as intrinsically connected with the rejection of arbitrary authority, particularly that which had long been assumed by the clergy. Let's gather together the strands of our argument so far. By the mid 17th century, legal and political thinkers in Europe were beginning to toy with the idea of an egalitarian state of nature, at least in the minimal sense of a default state that might be shared by societies which they saw as lacking government, writing, religion, private property, or other significant means to distinguishing themselves from one another. Terms like equality and inequality were just beginning to come into common usage in intellectual circles around the time, indeed, that the first French missionaries set out to evangelize the inhabitants of what are now Nova Scotia and Quebec. Europe's reading public was growing increasingly curious about what such primordial societies might have been like, but they had no particular disposition to imagine men and women living in a state of nature as especially noble, let alone as rational skeptics and champions of individual liberty. This latter perspective was the product of a dialogic encounter. As we've seen, at first neither side, not the colonists of New France, nor the ingenious interlocutors, had much to say about equality. Rather, the argument was about liberty and mutual aid, or what might even be better called freedom and communism. We should be clear about what we mean by the latter term. Since the early mid-19th century, there have been lively debates about whether there was ever a thing that might legitimately be referred to as primitive communism. At the center of these debates, almost invariably, were the ingenious societies of the Northwest woodlands. Ever since Friedrich Engel, Friedrich, Friedrich Engels used the Rockies as a prime example of primitive communism in his The Origin of the Family, Private, Private Property and the State. Here, communism always refers to communal ownership, particularly of productive resources. As we've already observed, many American societies could be considered somewhat ambiguous in this sense. Women own and work the field individually, even though they store and dispose of the products collectively. Men own their, men own their own tools and weapons individually, even if they typically set out the game and spoils. However, there's another way to use the word communism, not as property regime, but in the or- but not as property regime, but in the original sense of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. There's also a certain minimal baseline communism which applies in all societies, a feeling that if another person's needs are great enough, say they are drowning, and the cost of meeting them is modest enough, say they are asking for you to throw them a rope, then of course any decent person would comply. Baseline communism of this sort could even be considered the very grounds of human sociability, since it is only one's bitter enemies who would not be treated this way. What varies is just how far it is felt such baseline communism should properly extend. In many societies, and American societies of that time appear to have been among them, it would have been quite inconceivable to refuse a request for food. For 17th century Frenchmen in North America, this was clearly not the case. The range of Western communism appears to have been quite restricted and did not extend to food and shelter, something which scandalized Americans. But just as we early witnessed a confrontation between two very different concepts of equality, here we are ultimately witnessing a clash between very different concepts of individualism. Europeans were constantly squabbling for advantage societies of the northern woodlands, by contrast, guaranteed one another the means to an autonomous life, or at least ensured no man of a woman was subordinated to any other. Insofar as we can speak of communism, it existed not in the opposition to, but it existed not in opposition to, but in support of the individual freedom. The same could be said of indigenous political systems that Europeans encountered across much of the Great Lakes region. Everything operated to ensure that no one's will would be subjugated to that of anyone else. It was only over time, as Americans learned much of, as Americans learned more about Europe, and Europeans began to consider what it would mean to translate American ideals of individual liberty into their own societies, that the term equality began to gain ground as a feature of the discourse between them, in which we introduce the Wendat philosopher's statements Candiarong and explain how his views on human nature and society took a new life in the salons of Enlightenment Europe, including an aside including a side on the concept of schismogenesis. In order to understand how the ingenious critique the consistent moral and intellectual assault on European society, widely voiced by Native American observers from the 17th century onwards, evolved and its full impact on European thinking. We first need to understand something about the role of two men, an improvised French aristocrat named Louis, Louis Armand de Lorme d'Arc, Baron de la Hontan, and an usual Brilliant Wendat stat, statesman named Candiarong. In 16, in 1683, La Hontan, as he came to be known, the 17 years old, joined the French army and was posted to Canada. Over the course of the next decade, he took part in a number of campaigns and exploratory expeditions, eventually attaining the rank of deputy to the Governor General de Comte de Frontenac. In the process, he became fluent in both Algonquian and Wendat, and by his own account at least, good friends with a number of indigenous political figures. La Hontan later claimed that because he was something of a skeptic in religious matters and a political enemy of the Jesuits, these figures were willing to share with him their actual opinions about Christian teachings. One of them was Candiarong. A key strategist of the Wendat Confederacy, a coalition of a coalition of four Iroquoian-speaking peoples, Kandiarong. His name literally means the muscat, and the French often referred him simply the rat. Was at was at the time engaged in a complex geopolitical game, trying to play the English, French, and Five Nations of the house how they Haudenosaunee off against each other with the initial aim of averting a disastrous Haudenosaunee assault on the Wendat, but with the long-term goal of creating a comprehensive indigenous alliance to hold off the Sutter advance. Everyone who met him, friend or foe, admitted he was a truly remarkable individual, a courageous warrior, brilliant orator, and unusually skillful politician. He was also, to the very end of his life, a staunch opponent of Christianity. Lawton's own career came to a bad end. Despite having successfully defended Nova Scotia against an English fleet, he ran foul of its governor and was forced to flee French territory. Convicted in absentia of insubordination, he spent most of the next decade in exile, wandering about Europe trying, unsuccessfully, to negotiate a return to his native France. By 1702, La Hontan was living in Amsterdam and very much down on his luck, described by those who met him as penniless vagrant and freelance spy. All that was to change when he published a series of books about his adventures in Canada. Two were, memoir, two were memoirs of his American adventures. The third, entitled Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense who has travelled, 1703, comprised a series of four conversations between Lahontan and Kandiarong, in which the Wenda sage, voicing opinions based on his own ethnographic observations of Montreal, New York, and Paris, cast an extremely critical eye on European mores and ideas about religion, politics, health, and sexual life. These books won a wide audience, and before long, La Hontan had become something of a minor celebrity. She settled at the court of Hanover, which was also the home base for Leibniz, who befriended and supported him before the before La Hontan fell ill and died around 1715. Most criticism of La Hontan's work simply assumed simply assumes as a matter of course that the dialogues are made up and that the arguments attributed to Adario, the name given there to Candiarong, are, are the opinions of La Hontan himself. In a way, this conclusion is unsurprising. Adario claims not only to have visited France but but expresses opinions on everything from monastic politics to legal affairs. In the debate on religion, he often sounds like an advocate of of the disposition that, that spiritual truth should be sought in reason, not revelation, embracing just the sort of rational skepticism that was becoming popular in Europe's more daring intellectual cycles at the time. It is also true that the style of La Hontan's dialogues seems partly inspired by the ancient Greek writings of the satirist Lucian, and also that given the prevalence of church censorship in in France at the time, the easiest way for a free thinker to get away with publishing an open attack on Christianity probably would have been to compose a dialogue pretending to defend the faith from the attacks on an imaginary foreign skeptic and then make sure one loses all the arguments. In the recent decades, however, indigenous scholars returned to the material in light of what we know about Kandiarong himself and came to the very different conclusions. The real-life Adagio was famous not only for his eloquence, but was known for engaging in debates with Europeans of just the sort recorded in La Hontan's book. As Barbara, as Barbara Alice Mann remarks, despite the almost unanimous chorus of Western scholars insisting the dialogues are imaginary, there is excellent reason for accepting them as genuine. First, there are the first-hand accounts of Candiarong's oratorical skills and dazzling wit. Father Pierre de Charle, Charlevoix described Candiarong as so naturally eloquent that no that no one perhaps ever exceeded him in mental capacity. An exceptional council speaker, he was not less brilliant in conversation in private and concealment and negotiators often took pleasure in provoking him to hear repartees, always animated, full of wit, and generally answerable. He was the only man in Canada who was a match from the he was who was a match from the governor called the Frontenac, who often who often invited him to his table to give his officers displeasure. During the 1690s, in other words, the Montreal-based governor and his officers, presumably including his sometime deputy La Hontan, hosted a proto-Enlightenment salon when they invited Candiarong to debate exactly the sort of matters that appeared in the dialogues and which and in which it was Candiarong who took the position of rational skeptic. What's more, there is every reason to believe that Candiarong actually had been to France. That's to say, we know that when that confederation did send an ambassador to visit the court of Louis XIV in 1961, in 1691, and Candiarong's office at the time was Speaker of the Council, which would have made him the logical person to send. While the intimate knowledge of European affairs and understanding of European psychology attributed to Addario might seem implausible, Candiarong was a man who had been engaged in political negotiations with Europeans for years and regularly can cycle around them by anticipating their logic, interests, blind spots, and reactions. Finally, many of the critics of Christianity and European ways more generally attributed to Addario correspond almost exactly to criticisms that are corroborated from other speakers of European language all around the same time. Lahontan himself claimed to have based the dialogue on notes jot down during or after a variety of conversations he'd had with Candiarong at Michilimackinac on the strait between the Lake Huron and Michigan, notes that he later reorganized with the governor's help, and which were supplemented, no doubt, by reminiscences both had of similar debates had over Frontenac's dinner table. In the process of the text was no doubt augmented and embellished and probably tweaked again when La Hontan produced his final edition in Amsterdam. There is, however, every reason to believe the basic arguments were Candiarong on. La Hontan anticipates some of these arguments in his memoir, when he notes that Americans who had actually been to Europe here. He was very likely thinking primarily of Candiarong himself, as well as a number of former captives who had been put to work as galley slaves came back contemptuous of European claims to cultural superiority. Those Native Americans who had been immigrants, he wrote, were continually teasing us with the faults and disorders they observed in our towns as being occasioned by money. There is no point in trying to remonstrate with them about how useful the distinction of property is. For the support for the support of society, they make a joke of anything you say on that account. In short, they neither carry on nor fight, nor slander one another. They scoff at arts and sciences, and laugh at the difference of ranks which is observed with us. They brand us for slaves and call us miserable souls whose life is not worth having, alleging that we degrade ourselves in subjecting ourselves to one man, the king, who possesses all the power and is bound by no law but his own will. In other words, we find here all the familiar criticisms of European society that the earliest missionaries had to contend with, describing the lack of mutual aid, the blind submission to authority, but with the new element added in, the organization of private property. Lahontan continues, they think it uncountable that one man should have more than another, and that the rich should have more respect than the poor. In short, they say, the name of savages which we bestow upon them would feel ourselves better, since there is nothing in our actions that bears in an appearance of wisdom. Native Americans who had the opportunity to observe French society from from up close had come to realize one key difference from their own, one which may not otherwise have been apparent. Whereas in their own societies there was no obvious way to convert wealth into power over others, with the consequence that differences of wealth had little effect on individual freedom. In France, the situation could not have been more different. Power over positions could be directly translated into power over other human beings. But here, let us give the floor to Kandiarong himself. The first of the dialogues is about religious matters, in which Lahontan allows his voice calmly to pick apart the logical contradictions and incoherence of the Christian doctrines of original sin and redemption, paying particular attention to the concept of hell, as well as casting doubt on the historicity of Scripture. Kandiarong continually emphasizes the fact that Christians are divided into endless sects, each convinced they are entirely right and that all the other the others are hellbound. To give a sense of its flavor, Kandiarong, come on, my brother, don't get don't get up in arms. It's only natural for Christians to have faith in the Holy Scriptures, since for their infancy they've heard so much of them. Still, it is nothing if not reasonable for those born without such prejudice, such as the Wendat, to examine matters more closely. However, having thought long and hard over the course of a decade about what the Jesuits have what what the Jesuits have told us of the life and death of the Son of the Good Spirit, anyone that could give you 20 reasons against the notion. For myself, I've always I've always held that if it were possible that God had lowered his standards sufficiently to come down to earth, he would have done it in full view of everyone, descending in triumph with pomp and majesty, and most publicly. He would have gone from nation to nation, performing mighty miracles, thus giving everyone the same laws. Then we would all have then we would all have had exactly the same religion, uniformly spread and equally known throughout the four corners of the world, proving to our descendants from then till 10,000 years into the future the truth of this religion. Instead, there are 5 of 600 religions, each distinct from the other, of which, according to you, the religion of the French alone is good, scientific, or true. The last passage reflects perhaps Candiaron's most telling point: the extraordinary self-importance of the Jesuit conviction that an all-knowing and all-powerful being would freely choose to entrap himself in flesh and undergo terrible suffering for all the sake of a single species designed to be, imperfect, only some of which were going to be rescued from damnation anyway. Then follows a chapter on the subject of law, when Kandiarong takes the position that European style punitive law, like the religious doctrine of eternal damnation, is not necessitated by any inherent corruption of human nature, but rather by a form of social organization that encourages selfish and acquisitive behavior. Lahontan objects. True reason is the true reason is the same for all humans, but the fair existence of judges and punishments shows that not everyone is capable of following its dictates. Lahontan. This is why the this is why the weak need to be punished and the good need to be rewarded. Otherwise, murder, robbery, and defamation would spread everywhere, and in a word, we would become the most miserable people upon the face of the earth. Kandiarong. For my own part, I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be, that they have to be forced to good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment? You have observed that we lack judges. We lack judges. What is the reason for that? Well, we never bring lawsuits against one another. And why do we never bring lawsuits? Well, because we made a decision neither to accept or make use of money. And why do we refuse to allow money into our communities? The reason is this: we are determined not to have laws, because since the world was a world, our ancestors have been able to live contentedly without them. Given that the one that must create certainly did have a legal code, this might seem disingenuous on Kandiarong's part. By laws, however, he is clearly referring to laws of a coercive or punitive nature. He goes on to dissect the failings of the French legal system, dwelling particularly on judicial persecution, false testimony, torture, witchcraft accusations, and differential justice for rich and poor. In conclusion, he swings back to his original observation: the whole apparatus of trying to force people to behave well be to have be, to behave well would be unnecessary if France did not also maintain a contrary apparatus that encourages people to behave badly. That apparatus consisted of money, property rights, and the resultant pursuit of material self-interest. Kandiarong. I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman, and I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that What you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrann of the prince, the source of all devils, the bane of souls and southern hosts of the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, of all the worst behavior. Fathers sell their children, husbands their wives betray their husbands, brothers kill each other, friends are false, and all because of money. In the light of all this, tell me that we, when that are not right in refusing to touch or so much as to look at silver. For Europeans in 1703, this was heady stuff. Much of the subsequent exchange consists of the Frenchman trying to convince Candiarong of the advantages of adopting European civilization, and Candiarong countering that the French would do much better to adopt the Wendat way of life. Do you seriously imagine, he says, that I would be happy to live like one of the inhabitants of Paris, to take 2 hours every morning just to put on my shirt and makeup, to bow and scrape before every obnoxious galoot I meet on the street who happen to have been born with an inheritance? Do you really imagine I could carry a purse full of coins and not immediately hand them over to people who are hungry? That I would carry a sword but not immediately draw it on the first band of thugs I see rounding up the destitute to press them into naval service? If, on the other hand, La Hontan were to adopt an American way of life, Candiarong tells him it might take a while to adjust, but in the end, he'd be far happier. Kandiarong had a point. As we've seen in the last chapter, settlers adopted in the indigenous societies almost never wanted to go back. Kandiarong is even willing to propose that Europe would be better off if its whole social system was dismantled. La Hontan, try for once in your life to actually listen. Can't you see, my dear friend, that the nations of Europe cannot could not survive without gold and silver or some similar precious symbol? Without it, nobles, priests, merchants, and any number of others who lack the strength to work the soil would simply die of hunger. Our kings would not would not be kings. What soldiers would we have? Who would work for kings or anybody else? It would plunge Europe into chaos and and create the most dismal confusion imaginable. You honestly think you are going to sway me by appealing to the needs of nobles, merchants, and priests? If you abandon conceptions of mine and thine, yes, such distinctions between men would dissolve. A leveling equality would then take its place among you, as it now does among the Wendat. And yes, for the first 30 years after the vanishing of self interest, no doubt you will indeed see a certain desolation, as those who are only qualified to eat, drink, sleep, and take pleasure would languish and die. But their progeny would be fit for our way of living. Over and over I have set forth the qualities that we Wendat believe ought to define humanity: wisdom, reason, equity, etc., and demonstrated that the existence of separate material interests knocks all this on the head. A man motivated by the interest cannot be a man of reason. Here, finally, equality is invoked as a self-conscious ideal, but only as the result of prolonged confrontation between American and European institutions and values, and as a calculated provocation, turning European civilizing discourse backwards on itself. One reason why modern commentators have found it so easy to dismiss Kandiarong as the ultimate noble savage, and therefore as mere projection of European fantasies, is because many of his assertions are so obviously exaggerated. It's not really true that the Wendat or other American societies had no laws, never quarreled, and knew no inequalities of wealth. At the same time, as we've seen, Kandiarong's basic line of argument is perfectly consistent with what French missionaries and settlers in North America had been hearing from other indigenous Americans to argue that because the dialogues romanticized they can really reflect what he said is to assume that pe- is, to- is to assume that people are incapable of romanticizing themselves, despite the fact that this is what unskillful debaters is likely to do under such circumstances, and all sources concur that Candiero was perhaps the most skillful that ever met. Back in the 1930s, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson coined the term schismogenesis to describe wise people's tendency to defend themselves against one another. Imagine two people getting into an argument about some minor political disagreement, but after an hour, ending up ending up taking positions so intransigent that they find themselves on completely opposite sides of some ideological divide. Even taking extreme positions, they would never embrace. They would never embrace under ordinary circumstances, just to show how much they completely reject the other's points. They start out as moderate social democrats of slightly different flavors, because a few heated hours are over. One has one has somehow because a Leninist, the other an advocate of the ideas of Milton Friedman. We know this of thing can happen in arguments. Patterson suggested such processes can become institutionalized on a cultural level as well. How, he asks, do boys and girls in Papua New Guinea come to come to come to behave so differently, despite the fact that no one ever explicitly instructs them about how boys and girls are supposed to behave. It's not just by imitating their elders, it's also because boys and girls is learned to find the behavior of the opposite sex distasteful and try to be as little like them as possible. What starts as minor learned differences become exaggerated until women come to think of themselves as, and they increasingly actually become everything that men are not. And of course, men do the same thing towards women. Batterson was interested in psychological processes within societies, but there's every reason to believe something similar happens within societies as well. People come to define themselves against their neighbors. Urbanists thus become more urban as barbarians becomes more barbarous. If national character can be can really be said to exist, it can only be as a result of such seismogenetic processes. English people trying to become as little as possible like French people as little like Germans, and so on. If nothing else, they will all definitely exaggerate their differences in arguing with some another. In a historical confrontation of civilizations like that taking place along the east coast of North America in the 17th century, we can expect to see two contradictory processes. On the one hand, It is only to be expected that people on both sides of the divide will learn from one another and adopt each other's ideas, habits, and technologies. Americans began using European muskets. European settlers began to adopt more indulgent American approaches to disciplining children. At the same time, they will also almost invariably do the opposite, picking out certain points of contrast and exaggerating or idealizing them, eventually even trying to act, in some respects, as little like their new neighbors as possible. Kandiarong's focus on money is typical of such situations. To this day, ingenious societies incorporated into the global economy from Bolivia to Taiwan almost invariably frame their own traditions, as Marcel Saldins puts it, by opposition to their white man's living in the way of money. Living in the way of money. All this would be rather trivial concerns had La Hontan's book not been so successful, but they were to have an enormous impact on European sensibilities. Kan dia wrong opinion Candiarong opinions were translated into German, English, Dutch, and Italian and continued in print in multiple editions for over a century. Any any self-respecting intellectual of the 18th century would have been would have been almost certain to have read them. They also inspired a flood of imitations. By 1721, Parisian theatergoers were flocking to the Lycée de la Fêtières comedy Les Arquins Savages, the story of a wind that broke to France by a young sea captain, featuring a long series of indignant monologues in which the hero attributes the ills of French society to private property, to money, and in particular to the monstrous inequality which makes the poor the slaves of the rich. The play was revived almost yearly for the next 2 decades. Even more strikingly, just about every major French Enlightenment figure tried their hand at a Lahontan style critic of their own society from the perspective of some imagined outsider. Montesquieu chose a Persian, the Marquis de Argens, a Chinese, Diderot a Tahitian, a Chateaubriand a Natchez, Voltaire was half Wendat and half French. All took up and developed themes and arguments borrowed directly from Kandiarong, supplemented by lines from other savage critics in travelers' accounts. Indeed, a strong case can be made for the real origins of the Western gaze, the rational, supposedly objective, objective way of looking at strange and exotic cultures and which came to characterize later European anthropology, lying not in travelers' accounts, but rather in European accounts of precisely these imaginary skeptical natives gazing in what burrow furrowed at the exotic curiosities of European itself. Perhaps the single most popular work of this genre, publishing in 1747, was Letter of Peruvian Woman by the preeminent Salonist Madame de Graffigny, which view French society through the eyes of an imaginary kidnapped Inca princess. The book is considered a feminist landmark in that it may well be the first European novel about a woman which does not end with the protagonist either marrying or dying. Gravigny's Inca heroine, Celia, is as critical of the vanities and absurdities of European society as she is of patriarchy. By 19th century, the novel was remembered in some quarters as the first work to introduce of the notion of state socialism to general public. Celia, wondering why the French king, despite levying all sorts of heavy taxes, cannot simply redistribute the wealth in the same manner as the Sapa Inca in 1751. Preparing a second edition of her book, Madame de Graffigny sent letters to a variety of friends asking for suggested changes. One of these correspondents was a 23-year-old seminary student and budding economist A.R.G. Turgot, and we happened to have a copy of his reply, which was long and highly, if constructively critical. Turgot's text could hardly be more important, since it marks a key moment in his own intellectual development, the point where he began to turn his most lasting contribution to human thought, the idea of material economic progress, into a general theory of history, in which we explain the demiurgic powers of I.R.J. Turgot and how he turned the ingenious critic of European civilization on its head, laying the basis for most modern views of social evolution, or how an argument about freedom become one about equality. The Inca Empire could hardly be described as egalitarian. Indeed, it was an empire, but Madame de Graffigny represented it as a benevolent despotism, one in which are ultimately equal before the king. Zelia's critique of France, like that of all imaginary outsiders writing in the tradition of Calderon, focuses of the lack of individual freedom in French society and its violent inequalities. But Turgot found such thinking disturbing, even dangerous. Yes, Turgot acknowledged, we all have the idea of freedom and equality in principle, but we must consider a larger context. In reality, he felt that the freedom and equality of savages is not a sign of their superiority, it is a sign of inferiority, since it is only possible in a society where its household is largely self-sufficient and therefore where everyone is equally poor. So, as societies evolve, to good reason, technology advanced, natural differences in talents and capacities between individuals which have always existed become more significant, and eventually they form the basis for an even more complex division of labor. We progress from simple societies like those of the Wendat to our own complex commercial civilization, in which the poverty and dispossession of some, however lamentable it may be, is nonetheless the necessary condition for the prosperity of social as a whole. There is no avoiding such inequality, concluded Turgot in his reply to Madame de Graffigny. The only alternative, according to him, would be massive, in-caste state intervention to create a uniformity of social conditions and enforce inequality, which could only have the effect of crushing all initiative and therefore result in economic and social catastrophe. In light of this, Turgot suggested Madame de Graffigny rewrite her novel in such a way as to have Celia realize these terrible implications at the end of the book. Unsurprisingly, Graffigny ignored his advice. A few years later, Turgot would elaborate the same ideas in a series of lectures on world history. He had already been arguing for some years for the primacy of technological process as a driver for overall social improvement. In these lectures, He developed this argument into an explicit theory of stages of economic development. Social evolution, he reasoned, always begins with hunters, then moves on to a stage of pastoralism, then farming, and only then finally passes to the contemporary stage of urban commercial civilization. Those who still remain hunters, shepherds, or simply farmers are best understood as vestige of our own previous stages of social development. In this way, theories of social evolution, now so familiar that we rarely dwell on their origins, first came to be articulated in Europe as a direct response to the power of indigenous critique. Within a few years, Turgot's breakdown of all societies into four stages was appearing in the lectures of his friend and intellectual ally Adam Smith in Glasgow, and was worked into a general theory of human history by Smith's colleagues, men like Lord Camus, Adam Ferguson, and John Millar. The new paradigm soon began to have a profound effect on how indigenous people were imagined by European thinkers and by the European public more generally. Observers who had previously considered on the modes of subsistence and division of labor in North American societies to be trivial matters or of at best secondary importance, now began assuming that they were the only thing that really mattered. Everyone was to be sorted along the same grand evolutionary ladder, depending on their primary mode of acquiring food. Egalitarian societies were banished to the bottom of this ladder, where at best they could provide some insight on how our distant ancestors m- might have lived, but certainly could no longer be imagined as equal parties to a dialogue about how the inhabitants of wealthy and powerful societies should conduct themselves in the present. Let's pause for a moment to take stock. In the years between 1703 and 1751, as we've seen, the ingenious American critique of European society had an enormous impact on European thought. What began as widespread expressions of outrage and distaste by Americans by Americans were first exposed to European mores, eventually evolved through a thousand conversations conducted in dozens of languages from Portuguese to Russian into an argument about the nature of authority, decency, decency, social, resp- social responsibility, and above all, freedom. As it became clear to French observers that most indigenous Americans saw individual autonomy and freedom of action as consummate value organizing their own lives in such a way as to minimize any possibility of one human being becoming subordinated to the will of another, and hence viewing French society as essentially one of Rosseau's slaves. They reacted in a variety of different ways. Some, like the Jesuits, condemned the principle of freedom outright. On others, other settlers, intellectuals, and members of the reading public back home came to see it as a provocative and appealing society proposition. Their conclusions on this matter, incidentally, bore no particular relation to their feelings about indigenous populations themselves, whom they were often happy to see exterminated. But though, in fairness, they were public figures on both sides of the intellectual divide who strongly opposed aggression against foreign peoples. In fact, the ingenious critic of European institutions of European institutions was seen as so powerful that anyone objecting to existing intellectual and social arrangements would tend to deploy it as a weapon of choice, a game, as we've seen played by pretty much every one of the great Enlightenment philosophers in this process, and we've seen how this was already happening with Lahontan and Kandiarong. An argument about freedom also became increasingly an argument about equality. Above all, though all this appeals to the wisdom of savages, were still ways of challenging the arrogance of received authority, that medieval certainty which maintained that the judgments of the church and the establishment it upheld, having embraced the correct version of Christianity, were necessarily superior to those of anyone else on earth. To God's case reveals just how much those particular notions of civilization, evolution, and progress, which we have, which we've come to think of as the very core of Enlightenment thought, are in fact relative comers to that critical tradition. Most importantly, it shows how the development of these notions came in direct response to the power of the indigenous critique. Indeed, it was to take an enormous effort to salvage that very sense of European superiority which Enlightenment thinkers had aimed to upend and settle of the center. Certainly, over the next century and more, such ideas became a remarkably successful strategy for doing so, but they also created a wealth of contradictions. For instance, the peculiar fact of that European colonial empires, unlike almost any other in history, were forced to expose their own ephemerality, claiming to be mere temporary vehicles to speed up the subject's march to civilization. At least those subjects who, unlike the Wendat, they hadn't largely wiped off the map. At this point, we find ourselves back full. cy- At this point, we find ourselves back full cycle with Rousseau. How Jean-Jacques Rousseau, having won one the prestigious essay competition, then lost another, coming in over the permitted word length, but finally went on to conquer the whole of human history. The exchange between Madame de Gavigny and Turgot gives us a sense of intellectual debate in France in the early 1750s, at least in the Salonist cycles with which Rousseau was familiar, where freedom and equality were universal values, or were they, at least in their pure form, inconsistent with a regime based on private property? Did the progress of arts and sciences lead to improve understanding of the world and therefore to moral progress as well? Or was the indigenous critique correct and the word of power of France simply a perverse side effect of unnatural, even pathological social arrangements? These were the questions on every debater's lips or at the time. If we know anything about those debates today, it's largely because of the influence on Rousseau's essay. The discourse on the origins of social inequality has been taught, debated, and picked apart in the thousand classrooms, which is odd, because in many ways it is very much an eccentric liar, even by the standards of its time. In the early part of his life, Rousseau was known mainly as an aspiring composer. His rise to prominence as a social thinker began in 1750 when he took part in a contest sponsored by the Académie Learned Society, the Académie de Dijon, on the question: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to moral improvement? Rousseau won first pri- Rousseau won first prize and national fame with an essay in which he argued with great passion that he had not. Our elementary moral intuitions, he asserted, are fundamentally decent and sound. Civilization merely corrupts by encouraging us to value from our content. Almost the examples in this discourse on the arts and sciences are taken from classical Greek and Roman sources, but in his footnotes Rousseau hints at other sources of inspiration. I don't dare speak of those happy nations who do not know who do not know even the names of the vices which we have such trouble controlling, of those American savages whose simple and natural ways of keeping public order maintained ra- does not hesitate to prefer not merely to the laws of Plato, but even to, to anything more perfect which philosophy will ever be able to dream up for governing a people. He cites a number of striking examples of this for those who understand how to admire them. What's more, he says, they don't wear breeches. Rousseau's victory sparked something of a scandal. It was considered controversial, to say the least, for an academy dedicated to the advancement of the arts and sciences to award top honors to an argument stating that the arts and sciences were entirely counterproductive. As for Rousseau, he spent much of the next as for Rousseau, he spent much of the next several years writing well-publicized responses to criticisms of the piece, as well as using his new fame to produce a comic opera, The Village Soothsayer, which became popular at the French court. In 1754, the Académie de Dijon announced a new contest on the origins of social inequality. They clearly felt they had to put the upstart in his place. Rousseau took the bait. He submitted an even more elaborate treatise, clearly designed to shock and confound. Not only did it fail to win the prize, which was bestowed on a very conventional essay by a representative of the religious establishment named Abbe Talbert, who attributed our current unequal condition largely to original sin, but the judges announced that since Rousseau's submission went far over the word limit, they had not even read it all the way through. Rousseau's essay is undoubtedly odd. It also not exactly what it's often claimed to be. Rousseau does not, in fact, argue that human society begins in a state of idyllic innocence. He argues, rather confusingly, that the first humans were essentially good, but nonetheless systematically avoided one another for fear of violence. As a result, human beings in a state of nature were solitary creatures, which allows him to make a case that society itself, that is, any form of ongoing association between individuals, was necessarily a restraint on human freedom. Even language marked a compromise. But the real innovation Rousseau introduces comes at the key moment of humanity's fall from grace, a moment triggered, he argues, by the emergence of poverty relations. Rousseau's model of human society, which he repeatedly emphasized, is not meant to be taken literally, but is simply a thought experiment in force three stages. A purely imaginative state of nature when individuals live in isolation from one another, a stage of Stone Age savagery which followed the invention of language, in which he includes most of the modern inhabitants of North America and other actually observable savages. Then finally, civilization, which followed by the invention of agriculture and metallurgy. Each marks a moral decline, but as Rousseau is careful to emphasize, the entire parable is a way to understand what made it possible for human beings to accept the notion of private property in the first place. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, and murders, how much misery and horror the human race would have been spared if someone had pulled up the stakes and filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone, and that the earth itself belongs not to one." But it is highly probable that by this time, by this time, things had reached a point beyond which they could not go on as they were, for the idea of poverty, depending on many prior ideas which could only have arisen in successive stages, was not formed all at once in the human mind. Here, Rousseau asks exactly the same question that puzzled so many indigenous Americans. How is it that Europeans are able to turn wealth into power, turn a mere unequal distribution of material goods which exists, at least to some degree, in any society, into the ability to tell others what to do, to employ them as servants, workmen, or grenadiers, or simply to feel that it was no concern of theirs if they were left dying in the various bundle on the street. While Rousseau does not cite La Hontan or the Jesuit religions directly, he was clearly familiar with them as any intellectual of the time would have been, and his work is informed by the same critical questions. Why are Europeans so competitive? Why do they not share food? Why do they submit themselves to other people's orders? Rousseau's long excursus on pity, the natural sympathy that, he argues, savages have for one another, and quality that holds off the worst depredations of civilization in its second phase, only makes sense in light of the constant indigenous exclamations of dismay to be found in those books that Europeans just don't seem to care about each other, that they are neither generous nor kind. The reason for the essay astonishing success, then, is that for all this sensational style, it's really a kind of clever compromise between two or perhaps even three contradictory positions on the most urgent social and moral concerns of 18th century Europe. It manages to incorporate elements of the indigenous critique, echoes of the biblical narrative of the fall, and at least looks at something that at least looks a good deal like the evolutionary stages of material development. that were only just being propounded around that time by Turgot and Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. Rousseau agrees in a sense with Candiaron's view that civilized Europeans were by and by and large atrocious creators for for all the reasons that the Wendat had outlined, and he agreed that poverty is the root of the problem. The one major difference between them is that Rousseau, unlike Candiarong, cannot really envisage society being based on anything else. In translating the indigenous critique into terms that French philosophers could understand, this sense of possibility is precisely what was lost. To Americans like Candiarong, there was no contradiction between individual liberty and communism. That's to say, communism in the sense we've been using it here, as a certain presumption of sharing that people who are actual enemies can be, can be expected to respond to one another's needs. In the American view, the freedom of the individual was assumed to be premised on a certain level of baseline communism, since, after all, the people who are starving or lack adequate clothes or shelter in a snowstorm are not really free to do much of anything other than whatever it takes to stay alive. The European conception of individual freedom as, by contrast, tied ineluctably to notions of private property. Legally, this association traces back above all to the power ho- of the male household head in ancient Rome, who could do whatever he liked with his cattle and possessions, including his children and slaves. In this view, freedom was always defined, at least potentially, as something exercised to the cost of others. What's more, there was a strong emphasis in ancient Roman and modern European law on the self-sufficiency of households. Hence, true freedom meant autonomy in the radical sense, not just autonomy of the will, but being in no way dependent on other human beings except those under except those under one's direct control. Rousseau, who always insisted he wished to live without being dependent on others' help, even as he he had all his needs attended to by mistress and servants, played out this very same logic in the conduct of his own life. When our ancestors, Rousseau wrote, made the fatal decision to divide the earth into individually owned plots, creating legal structures to protect their property, then governments to enforce those laws. They imagined they were creating the means to preserve their liberty. In fact, they ran headlong to the chains. This is a this is a powerful image, but it is unclear what Rousseau felt this lost liberty would actually have looked like, especially if, as he insisted, any ongoing human relationship, even one of mutual aid, is itself a restraint of liberty. It's hardly surprising that he ends up inventing a purely imaginary age in which each individual wandered alone among the trees. Most surprising, perhaps, that his imaginary world has come so then to define the arc of our own horizons. How did this happen? In which we consider relationships between the indigenous critic and the myth of progress and the birth of the left. As we've mentioned before, in the wake of the French Revolution, conservative critics blame Rousseau for almost everything. Many held him personally responsible for the guillotine. The dream of restoring the ancient state of liberty and equality, they argued, led to exactly the effects Turgot had predicted, an in-caste totalitarianism that could only be enforced through revolutionary terror. It is true that political radicals at the time of the American and French revolutions embraced Rousseau's ideas. Here, for example, is an extract purportedly for a manifesto written in 1777, which almost perfectly reproduces Rousseau's vision of evolutionism and critique of private property as leading directly to the origin of the state. As families as families multiplied, the means of subsistence began to fail. The nomad or roaming life ceased, and poverty started into existence. Men chose habitations. Agriculture made them intermix. Language became universal. Living together, one man began to measure his strength with another, and the weaker were distinguished from the stronger. This undoubtedly created the idea of mutual defense, of one individual governing the first family united, and of thus defending their persons and their faiths against the invasion of an enemy. But hence liberty was cracked in its foundation, and equality disappeared. These words are drawn from the purported manifesto of the secret order of the Illuminati, a network of revolutionary cadres organized within the Freemasons by a Bavarian law professor named Adam Weishaupt. The organization that exists in the late 18th century. Its purpose was apparently to educate uh, an enlightened international or even anti-national elite to work for the restoration of freedom and equality. Conservatives almost immediately denounced the order, leading to it being banned in 1785, less than 10 years after its foundation. But right-wing conspiracies insisted it continued to exist, and that the Illuminati were the hidden hands pulling the strings between, behind the French Revolution, or later even the Russian. This is silly, but one reason the fantasy was possible is that the Illuminati were perhaps the first to propose that a revolutionary vanguard trained in the correct interpretation of doctrine would be able to understand the overall direction of human history and therefore be capable of intervening to speed up its progress. It may seem ironic that Rousseau, who began his career by taking what he would now consider an arch-conservative position, that seeming progress leads only to moral decay, would end up becoming the supreme bad noir of so many conservatives. But a special vitriol, but a special vitriol is always reserved for traitors. Many conservative thinkers see Rousseau as having gone full cycle from a promising start to creating what we now think of as the political left. Nor are they entirely wrong in this. Rousseau was indeed a crucial figure in the formation of left-wing thought. One reason intellectual debates of the mid-18th century seem so strange to us nowadays is precisely that what we understand as left or right divisions had not yet crystallized. At the time of the American Revolution, the term left and right themselves did not yet exist. A product of decade immediately following, They originally referred to the respective sitting positions of aristocratic and popular factions in the French National Assembly of 1789. Let us emphasize, we really shouldn't have to, that Rousseau's effusions on the fundamental decency of human nature and lost ages of freedom and equality were in a sense themselves responsible for the French Revolution. It's not as if he somehow caused the sans culottes to rise up by putting such ideas into their heads, as we've noted for the for most of European history. Intellectuals seem to have been the only class of people who weren't capable of imagining that other worlds might be brought into being. But we can argue that in folding together the indigenous critique and the doctrine of progress originally developed to counter it, Rousseau did in fact write the founding document of the left as an intellectual project. For the same reason, right-wing thought has from the beginning been suspicious not just about ideas of progress, but also the entire tradition that emerged from the indigenous critique. Today, we assume that it is largely lost on the political left, who speak about the myth of the noble savage, and that any early European account that idealizes faraway people or even attributes to them arrogant opinions is really just a romantic projection of European fantasies onto people the authors could never genuinely understand. The racist denigration of the savage and naive celebration of savage innocence are always treated as two sides of the same imperialist coin. Yet originally this Yet originally, this was an implicitly right-wing position as explained by Ter, by Ellingson, the contemporary anthropologist who has reviewed the subject most comprehensively. Ellingson conclude that conclude there never was a noble savage myth, at least not in the sense of a stereotype of simple societies living in an age of happy primordial innocence. Rather, travelers' accounts tend to supply a much more ambivalent picture, describing describing alien societies as a complicated, sometimes to them incoherent, mix of virtues and vices. What needs to be investigated instead might better be called the myth of the noble savage. Why is it that certain Europeans begin attributing such a naive position to others? The answer isn't pretty. The phrase noble savage was in fact popularized a century or so after Rousseau as a term of ridicule and abuse. It was deployed by a clique of outright racists who in 1859, as the British Empire reached its height of power, took over the British Ethnological Society and called for the extermination of inferior peoples. The original exponents of the idea blame Rousseau, but before long students of literary history were scoring the archives looking for traces of the noble savage everywhere. Almost almost all the texts almost all the texts discussed in this chapter came under scrutiny. All were dismissed as dangerous romantic fantasies. At first, however, these dismissals, dismissals came from the political right. Ellingsons make a practical example of Gilbert Chinard, whose 1913, vol- 1913 volume L'Amérique et le rêve exotique dans la littérature française American and the exotic dream in the French literature of the 17th and 18th centuries was primarily responsible for establishing the notion of the novel savage as a as a Western literary trope in American universities, since he was perhaps the least shy about his political agenda, citing La Hontan as the key figure in the formation of this notion. Chinnack argued that Rousseau borrowed specific arguments either from La Hontan's memoir or memoirs of his dialogues with Candiarong. In a broader sense, he detects an affinity of temperament. It is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, more than any other author, that the author of the dialogues with a savage resembles. With all his faults, his fundamentally ignorable motives, he has put into his style a passion and enthusiasm which has no equivalent except in the discourse of on equality. Like Rousseau, he is an anarchist. Like him, he is bereft of moral sensibility to a considerably greater degree. Like him, he imagines himself to be the prey of uh, of persecution of the human race, league, ag- le- persecution of the human race league against himself. Like him, he is indignant about the sufferings of the miserable, and even more than him, he out, he throws out the call to arms. And like him, above all, he attributes to property all the evils that we suffer. In this, he permits us to establish a direct connection between the Jesuit missionaries and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. According to Chinac, even the Jesuits, even the Jesuit La Hontan's ostensible enemies, were ultimately playing the same game of of introducing deeply subversive notions to to the back door. Their motives in quoting the exasperated observation of their interlocutors were not innocent. Commenting directly on the above passage, Ellingson quite reasonably asks what on the what on earth Jinat is actually talking about here. Some kind of anarchism, some kind of anarchist movement perpetrated by La Hontan, the Jesuits, and Rousseau, a conspiracy theory to explain the French revolutions. Yes, concludes Ellingson, it almost is. The Jesuits, according to Chinac, have promoted dangerous ideas in giving us the impression of the good qualities of savages, and this impression seems to have been contrary to the interests of the monarchical state to the mo- of the monarchical state and religion. In fact, Chinac's fundamental characterization of Kosovo is as un continuador des missionaries de Jesuits, and he holds the missionaries responsible for giving rise to the revolutionary spirits who would transform our society and inflame by reading their relations bring us back to the state of the American savage. For Chinat, whether or not European observers were reporting the views of their indigenous interlocutors accurately is irrelevant, for indigenous Americans were, as Chinat puts it, a race different from our own, with whom no meaningful relation was possible. One might as well, he implies, record the political opinions of a lay preacher. What really matters, he emphasized, that are the motives of the white people involved. And these people were clearly malcontents and troublemakers. He accuses one early observer on the customs on the Greenland Inuit of inserting a mix of socialism and Illuminism into his descriptions that is viewing savage customs through a lens that might as well have been borrowed from the secret order of the Illuminati. Beyond the myth of the stupid savage, why all these things matter so much for our project in this book. This is not the place to document how a right-wing critic morphed into a left-wing critic. To some degree, one can probably just put it down to the laziness of scholars schooled in the history of French or English literature, faced with the prospect of having to seriously engage with a 17th century Micmac might have been actually been thinking. To say Micmac to say Mi'kmaq thought is an important would be racist. To say it's unhonorable because the sources were racist, however, does rather let one off the hook for some degree to such reluctance to engage with indigenous sources is based on completely legitimate protest on the part of those who have historically been romanticized. Many have remarked that to those on the receiving end, being told you are inferior breed and that therefore anything you say can be ignored, and being told you are and being told you are an innocent child of nature or the embodiment of ancient wisdom, and that therefore everything you say must be treated as ineffably profound are almost equally annoying. Both attitudes appear designed to prevent any meaningful conversation. As we noted in our first chapter, when we set out when we set out to write this book, we imagined ourselves making a contribution to the burgeoning literature on the origins of social inequality, except this time one based on the actual evidence. As our research proceeded, we came to realize how realize just how strange a question, what are the origins of social inequality, really was, quite apart from the implications of primordial innocence. This way of framing the problem suggests a certain diagnosis of what is wrong with society and what can and can't be done about it, and as we've been, it often has very little to do with what people living in those societies we've come to call egalitarian. Actually film makes them different from others. Rousseau sidestepped the question by reducing the savage to mere thought experiments. He was just about the only major figure on the French Enlightenment who didn't write a dialogue or other imaginative work attempting to look at European society from a foreign point of view. In fact, he strips his savages of any imaginative powers of their own. Their happiness is entirely derived from their inability to imagine things otherwise, or to project themselves into the future in any way at all. They are thus also utterly lacking in philosophy. This is presumably why no one could foresee the disasters that would ensue. What they first stake out property and began to form a governments to protect it. By the time human beings were even capable of thinking that far ahead, the worst damage that had the worst image the worst damage had already been done. Back in nine Back in 1960s, the French anthropologist Pierre Cluster suggested that precisely the opposite was the case. What if the sort of people we like to imagine as simple and innocent are free of rules, governments, bureaucracies, ruling classes, and the like, not because they are lacking in imagination, but because they're actually more imaginative than we are. We find it difficult to picture what a truly free society would be like. Perhaps they have no similar trouble picturing what arbitrary power and domination would be like. Perhaps they cannot only imagine it, but consciously. arrange their society in such a way as to avoid it. As we'll see in the next chapter, Cluster's argument has its limits, but by insisting that the people studied by anthropologists are just as self-conscious but as imaginative as the anthropologists themselves. He did he did more to reverse the myth than anyone before or since. Rousseau has been accused of many crimes. He is innocent of most of them. If there is really a toxic element in his legacy, it is this: not his promulgation of the image of the novel savage, which he didn't really do, but his promulgation of what we might call the myth of the stupid savage, even if one he considered blissful in its state of stupidity. 19th century imperialists adopted the stereotype enthusiastically, merely adding on variety of ostensibly scientific justifications. From Darwinian evolution, from Darwinian evolutionism to scientific racism, to elaborate on that notion of innocent simplicity and thus provide a pretext for pushing the remaining free peoples of the world, or increasingly as European imperial expansion continued, the formerly free peoples into a conceptual space where their judgments no longer seem threatening. This is the work we are trying to undo. Liberty, equality, fraternity was rallying cry of the French Revolution. Today, there are whole disciplines, sub-branches of philosophy and political science and legal studies, which take equality as their principal subject matter. Everyone agrees that equality is a value. No one, no one seems to agree on what the term actually refers to: equality of opportunity, equality of condition, formal equality before the law. Similarly, something like the 17th century Mi'kmaq Algonquians or Wendat are regularly referred to as egalitarian societies, or if not, there are then as band or tribal societies, which is usually presumed to mean the same thing. It's never entirely clear exactly what the term is supposed to refer to. Are we talking about an ideology, belief, the belief that everyone in society should be the same? Obviously, not in all ways, but in certain respects that are considered particularly important. Or should it be one in which people actually are the same? What might either of these actually mean in practice? That all members of society have equal access to land, or treat each other with equal dignity, or are equally free to make their opinions known in public assemblies? Or are we talking about some scale of measurement that can be imposed by the observer: cash income, political power, calorie intake, house size, number, and equality of personal positions? Would equality mean the investment of individual or the celebration of the individual? After all, to an outside observer, a society where everyone was exactly the same, and one where they were also completely different as to preclude any sort of comparison, would seem equally egalitarian. Can one speak of equality in a society where elders are treated like gods and make all important decisions, if everyone in that society who survives past 50 will eventually become an elder? What about gender relations? Many societies referred to as egalitarian are only really egalitarian between adult men. Sometimes Relations between men and women in such societies are anything but equal. At other times, things are more ambiguous. It may be, for instance, that men and women in a given society are not only expected to perform different sorts of work, but hold different opinions about why work or what sorts of work is important in the first place, and therefore feel they have a higher status, or perhaps that their respective roles are so different it makes no sense to compare them. Many of the societies encountered by the French in North America fit this description. They could they could be seen as matriarchal from one perspective, patriarchal from another. In such cases, can we speak of gender equality? Or would we only be able to do so if men and women were also equal according to some minimal external criterion, being equally free from the threat of domestic violence, for example, or having equal access to resources, or equal say in communal affairs? Since there is no clear and generally accepted answer to any of these questions, use of the term egalitarian had led to endless arguments. In fact, it remains entirely unclear what egalitarian even means. Ultimately, the idea is employed not because it had any analytical substance, but rather for the same reason, seven, but, but rather for the same reason 17th century natural law theorists speculated about equality in the state of nature. Equality is the default term referring to that kind of protoplasmic mass of humanity one imagines as being left over, over when all the trappings of civilization are stripped away. Egalitarian people are those without princes, judges, overseers, or hereditary priests, and usually without cities or writing, or preferably even farming. They are societies of equal only in the sense of that all the most obvious tokens of inequality are missing. It follows that any historical work which purports to be about the origins of social inequality is really an inquiry into the origins of civilization, which in turn implies a vision of history like that of Turgot, which conceives civilization as a system of social complexity guaranteeing greater overall prosperity, but at the same time ensuring that certain compromises will necessarily have to be made in the areas of freedom and equality. We will be trying to write a different kind of history, which is which will also require a different understanding of civilization. To be clear, it's not that we consider the fact that princes, judges, overseers, or hereditary priests, or for that matter, writing cities and farming only emerged at a certain point in a human history to be uninteresting or insignificant. Quite on the contrary, in order to understand our current predicament as a species, it is absolutely crucial to understand how these things first came about. However, we would also insist that in order to do so, we would reject the impulse to treat our distant ancestors as some sort of primordial human soup. Evidence accumulating for archaeology, anthropology, and related fields suggests that, just like 17th century Amerindians and Frenchmen, the people of prehistoric times had very specific ideas about what was important in their societies, that this varied considerably, and that describing such societies as uniformly egalitarian tells us almost nothing about them. No doubt there was usually a degree of equality by default, an assumption that humans are all equally powerless in the face of the gods, or a strongly feeling that no one's will should be permanently subordinated to another's. Presumably, there must have been, if only to ensure that permanent princes, judges, overseers, or hereditary priests did not emerge for such long period of time, but self-conscious ideas of equality, putting equal forward as an explicit value, as opposed to an ideology of freedom, or dignity, or participation that applies equality to all, appear to have been relative latecomers to human history, and even when they do appear, they rarely apply to everyone. Ancient Athenian democracy, to take just one example, was based on political equality among its citizens, even if these were only somewhere between 10 and 20% of the overall population, in the sense that each had the same rights to participate in public decision making. We are taught to see this notion of equal civic participation as a milestone in political development, revived and expanded some 2,000 years later. As it happens, the political systems labeled democracies in 19th century Europe had almost nothing to do with ancient Athens. But this is not really the point. What's more to the point is that Athenian intellectuals at the time, who were mostly of aristocratic background, tended to consider the whole arrangement a tawdry business, and most of them much preferred the government of Sparta, ruled by an even smaller percentage of the total population who lived collectively off the labors of serfs. Spartan citizens, in turn, referred to themselves as the homoi, which could be translated as which could be translated either as it equals, those who are all the same. They all underwent the same rigorous military training, adopted the same haughty disdain for both effeminate luxuries and individual idiosyncrasies, ate in communal mess halls, and spent most of their lives practicing for war. This is not, then, a book about the origins of inequality, but it aims to answer many of the same questions in a different way. There is no doubt that something has gone terribly wrong with the world. A very small percentage of this population do control the fates of almost everyone else, and they are doing it in an increasingly disastrous fashion. To understand how the situation came about, we should trace the problem back to what first made possible the emergence of kings, priests, overseers, and judges. But we no longer have the luxury of assuming we really know in advance what the precise answers will turn out to be. Taking guidance for the indigenous critics like Candiarong, we need to approach the evidence of the human past with fresh eyes.